The monsoon rain hammered the canopy 40 meters above Sergeant Jim "Digger" McLeod's head. But down here in the green twilight of Phuoc Tuy Province, only fat drops made it through, irregular, unpredictable, like everything else in this jungle. It was May 17, 1969, day 7 of a long-range reconnaissance patrol, and McLeod hadn't spoken a word since his 5-man SAS patrol had inserted by helicopter into this corner of hell. Not one word. Not when they'd found the freshly cut trail on day 2. Not when they'd counted 147 NVA regulars moving south on day 4. Not when Private Danny Morris had nearly stepped on a bamboo viper on day 5. And not now, as McLeod watched through the undergrowth while an enemy patrol passed within 3 meters of his position. So close he could smell the fish sauce on their breath and see the red dirt caked under their fingernails. His hand moved. 2 fingers down. Enemy. Then a closed fist. Freeze. Behind him, 4 men became part of the jungle. No movement, no sound, barely breathing. The NVA soldiers walked past, their AK-47s slung casually, talking and laughing about something McLeod couldn't understand. They had no idea that 5 Australian ghosts had been living in their backyard for a week, watching, counting, mapping every trail and bunker complex within a 5-kilometer radius. What the North Vietnamese didn't know, what would cost them dearly in the months ahead, was that this silence wasn't just tactical discipline. It was a weapon. And the Australians had perfected it into something the enemy had never encountered before. The ability to simply vanish into the jungle and become invisible, inaudible wraiths who saw everything and revealed nothing until the moment they chose to kill. When Australian SAS patrols first arrived in Phuoc Tuy Province in 1966, even their American allies thought they were insane. The Yanks looked at us like we'd lost our minds, recalled Corporal Bob Digger Kearney of 3 Squadron SAS. 5 blokes, 10 days in the scrub, no resupply, no backup, and we're not even going to talk to each other. They thought it was a suicide mission dressed up as reconnaissance. The American approach to Vietnam was loud, mechanized, and overwhelming. Search and destroy operations involved companies or battalions, hundreds of men supported by artillery, helicopter gunships, and B-52 strikes. The jungle echoed with the sound of American firepower. The whump, whump, whump of Huey rotors, the crash of 150mm howitzers, the chatter of M60 machine guns. Radio communications crackled constantly. Orders were shouted. The Americans announced their presence like a steel elephant crashing through the forest. The Australians had a different philosophy, one forged in the jungles of Malaya and Borneo during the confrontation with Indonesia. Major John Essex Clark, commanding 3 Squadron SAS in 1966, explained it this way. The Americans want to find the enemy and destroy him with superior firepower. We want to find the enemy without him knowing we exist, learn everything about him, and then decide whether to kill him ourselves or call in the big guns. But first, and this is crucial, he must never know we're there. This fundamental difference in operational philosophy led to what would become the SAS's most distinctive and effective tactic: absolute silence during long-range patrols. The concept seemed straightforward enough in briefings at Nui Base. 5-man patrols, far smaller than American reconnaissance units, would insert deep into enemy territory. They would move slowly, perhaps only 500 meters per day. They would communicate entirely through hand signals developed and rehearsed until they became second nature. They would operate for 7 to 14 days without resupply. And critically, they would maintain complete noise discipline. No talking, no equipment rattling, no unnecessary movement. The first time I heard about it, I thought they were having a lend of me, said Private Terry O'Farrell, who joined 1 Squadron SAS in 1967. 10 days without talking? Mate, Australians can't go 10 minutes without taking the piss out of each other. But once you understood why, once you saw what silence could do, it made perfect sense. The tactical logic was elegant. The Viet Cong and NVA owned the jungle. They knew every trail, every water source, every hiding spot. They had civilian support networks providing intelligence. They moved like fish through water, as Mao had taught them. The only advantage foreign forces could hope to achieve was stealth, becoming even quieter, even more invisible than the enemy themselves. But there was another reason, one that the SAS troopers understood instinctively from their jungle warfare training. The human voice carries. In the dense, humid jungle of Phuoc Tuy, sound behavior was unpredictable. Sometimes absorbed completely by vegetation, sometimes bouncing and echoing in ways that made distance impossible to judge. The snap of a breaking stick might travel 10 meters. A whispered conversation could carry 50. Radio squelch or static could alert the enemy to your presence from 100 meters away. As Squadron Sergeant Major Jock Blue Healy put it, "The jungle will hide you if you let it. But the moment you make a sound that doesn't belong, a cough, a word, a carelessly scraped mess tin, you've told every VC within earshot exactly where you are. And then you're not a reconnaissance patrol anymore, you're a target." The silent patrol technique didn't emerge overnight. It was the culmination of 2 decades of Australian experience in jungle warfare, beginning with the long campaign against communist insurgents in Malaya, 1948-1960, and continuing through the Indonesian confrontation in Borneo, 1963-1966. In Malaya, British and Australian forces had learned hard lessons about fighting an elusive enemy in primary jungle. Conventional tactics failed. Large unit sweeps found nothing. The enemy melted away, warned by their extensive intelligence network. But small patrols, 3 or 4 men moving silently, living in the jungle for weeks, could get close, could observe, could ambush. The Malayan scouts, which would eventually become the British SAS, pioneered these techniques. Australian advisors, including future Vietnam commanders like Lieutenant Colonel Bob Haggerty, absorbed everything. "Malaya taught us that the jungle isn't your enemy," explained Captain John Harry Smith, who would later command D Company 6 RAR at the Battle of Long Tan. "The jungle is neutral. It will hide you or expose you depending on how you move through it. The British SAS showed us that if you slow down, if you become part of the environment, you can live there indefinitely. The enemy walks right past you." When Australia committed ground forces to Vietnam in 1965, starting with 1 RR, Royal Australian Regiment, they brought this jungle warfare doctrine with them. But it was the arrival of the SAS squadrons in 1966 that would truly demonstrate what silent operations could achieve. The Australian SAS, officially the Special Air Service Regiment, SASR, had been formed in 1957, modeled on the British SAS. By 1966, they had accumulated extensive experience in covert reconnaissance and counterinsurgency. 3 squadrons would rotate through Vietnam. 1 squadron, 1966-67, 2 squadron, 1967-68, and 3 squadron, 1968-71. Each squadron consisted of approximately 120 men organized into small patrol teams. The standard SAS patrol in Vietnam consisted of 5 men, a number chosen deliberately after years of experimentation. Patrol Commander. Usually a corporal or sergeant responsible for navigation and all tactical decisions, 2IC, second in command. Covered the commander's back, took over if he was killed. Medic. Essential for treating injuries without extraction. Signaler. Maintained radio contact with base for intelligence reports and emergency extraction. Scout Tracker. Usually positioned at point, responsible for reading signs and detecting enemy presence. 5 was the magic number. Small enough to remain undetected, large enough to handle most combat situations, structured enough to maintain security and effectiveness. American LRRP, long-range reconnaissance patrol teams typically operated with 6 to 8 men. The Australian reduction to 5 was intentional. One less man meant one less boot print, one less piece of equipment to rattle, one less chance of compromise. Training for silent operations was intensive and unforgiving. At the SAS camp in Swanbourne, Western Australia, and later at their tactical base in Nui Dat, patrols spent months learning to communicate without words. We developed a comprehensive system of hand signals, recalled Sergeant Ian Tracker McPherson of 2 Squadron. Everything from enemy ahead to prepare ambush, to aircraft overhead to I need to take a shit. And yes, that last one was important because even natural functions had to be coordinated silently. We'd practice these signals until they became reflexive. In the jungle, there's no time to remember what signal means what. It has to be instant. The signals themselves were simple but comprehensive. Closed fist, stop freeze, fingers indicating numbers, enemy count, hand cupped behind ear, listen, flat hand moved in cutting motion, enemy sighted, fingers walking, personnel moving, thumb down, take cover, tap on shoulder, move forward. Equipment was obsessively modified and tested for noise discipline. Everything that could rattle, click, or scrape was taped, padded, or removed. Metal dog tags were wrapped in rubber. Ammunition pouches were packed tight so rounds wouldn't shift. Weapons were meticulously cleaned and checked. Even the smallest mechanical click could compromise a patrol. Canteens were only filled 2/3 full to prevent sloshing. Radio antennas were shortened to reduce chances of snagging on vegetation. We'd shake down before every patrol, said Trooper Kevin Tiny Walsh, a signaller with 3 Squadron. Your mates would physically shake you. If anything rattled, it got fixed or left behind. If your equipment made noise, you weren't going out. Simple as that. The operation that would demonstrate the lethal effectiveness of silent reconnaissance began on August 18, 1966. And it started with a farmer's report. A local Vietnamese civilian in Phuoc Tuy province had told Australian intelligence officers about unusual activity near the abandoned village of Long Phuoc. Large numbers of Viet Cong, he said. Maybe a full regiment. Moving supplies, building bunkers. The information seemed almost too good. Enemy forces rarely concentrated in such numbers where they could be targeted. Major David Dave Savage, commanding the SAS squadron, made a decision. He would send a 5-man patrol deep into the suspected area. Their mission: observe, count, map, report. Under no circumstances were they to engage unless absolutely necessary. This was pure reconnaissance, eyes and ears only. Sergeant Rod Hookie Walker commanded the patrol. At 28, he was a veteran of Borneo and one of the most experienced patrol commanders in the squadron. His team included Corporal Dave Smokey Dawes, 2IC, Trooper Alan Doc Peters, medic, Trooper Mike Dusty Rhodes, signaller, and Trooper Jim Spider Webster, scout. They inserted by helicopter on the afternoon of August 18th, dropped into a small clearing 3 kilometers from the target area. The Huey pulled away, its rotor wash flattening the grass, and suddenly the jungle closed in around them. A green wall of silence that swallowed the retreating helicopter sound. Walker made a hand signal. Fingers walking. They moved. For the first 2 days, they covered barely 600 meters. Every step was calculated. Webster, on point, would move 3 paces, stop, listen, scan, then move again. Behind him, the others followed in single file. Each man separated by several meters. They placed their feet carefully, rolling from heel to toe, avoiding dead leaves and dry sticks. When they stopped, they froze completely. even controlling their breathing, taking slow, shallow breaths through their noses. The silence was absolute, Webster recalled years later. We'd been together for months, knew each other's habits, knew how each bloke moved. But once we went tactical, it was like operating with ghosts. You'd look back to check your spacing, and sometimes you couldn't even see the next man. He'd melted into the shadows, and not a sound, not a cough, not a cleared throat, nothing. On the third day, they found the trail. It wasn't a game trail or a local footpath. This was a military highway, 2 meters wide, hard-packed from thousands of boots, with fresh cutting marks on the vegetation to maintain clear passage. Boot prints overlapped in the mud. Ho Chi Minh sandals cut from truck tires, NVA issue rubber boots, even some American jungle boots taken from casualties. Walker held up his hand. The patrol froze. He moved forward silently, examining the trail, reading the story written in disturbed earth and bent grass. Heavy traffic. Recent. Within the last 6 hours. He estimated at least a company-sized element, maybe 120 men, had moved through heading south. He turned back to his team. His hands moved in quick, practiced signals. Enemy, large force, south, prepare hide. They melted back from the trail and found a position in dense undergrowth with good observation, but multiple escape routes. Then they settled in to watch and wait, communicating their findings back to base through carefully encoded radio bursts that lasted seconds. Over the next 48 hours, they counted 327 Viet Cong moving south along that trail. It was like watching ants on a highway, Peters remembered. They came in groups of 10 to 30, usually in the late afternoon or after dark. Some were porters carrying rice bags and ammunition. Some were regular VC with weapons. Some were clearly cadre, officers giving orders, checking maps. And they had no bloody idea we were 20 meters away. The patrol remained absolutely silent. When an NVA patrol stopped to rest directly in front of their position, so close that Rhodes could have thrown a rock and hit them, the Australians didn't move, didn't speak, barely breathed. For 6 hours, enemy soldiers sat, smoked, talked, and ate within arm's reach of 5 Australian soldiers who had become part of the jungle. Spider had a mozzie land on his nose, Dawes recalled. It bit him, drew blood. He didn't move, didn't even twitch, just let it bite him and fly away. That was the discipline we maintained. Absolute. Total. Because one sound, one movement, and we were all dead. On day 6, they found the bunker complex. Following the trail deeper, moving only at night now, they discovered an extensive underground headquarters. Bunkers reinforced with logs and earth. Fighting positions connected by communication trenches. A field hospital dug into a hillside. Supply caches covered with camouflage nets. This wasn't a temporary camp. This was a regimental headquarters, and it was directly in the path of the Australian 1 ATF, Australian Task Force, supply route. Walker's hand signals were urgent now. Major installation. Multiple bunkers. Prepare detailed map. Call it in. Rhodes carefully set up his radio, stringing the antenna through the undergrowth to get elevation without creating a visible signature. His transmission was brief, encoded, whispered so quietly into the handset that he could barely hear himself. Have found major enemy complex. Estimate regimental strength. Grid reference follows. The intelligence transformed Australian planning. What had been suspected was now confirmed. A major VC buildup was underway, preparing for a large-scale assault. The information Walker's patrol had gathered, silently, invisibly, over nearly a week, would lead directly to Operation Smithfield, and later to the Battle of Long Tan, where D Company 6 RAR would fight one of Australia's most significant actions of the war. But the patrol wasn't finished. They had 2 more days in the jungle, 2 more days of silence, 2 more days of watching the enemy move through their own territory completely unaware that Australian eyes were recording everything. On day 8, extraction finally came. But even then, with the Huey inbound, Walker maintained silence discipline until the last possible second. Only when the helicopter was overhead, rotors drowning out all other sound, did he speak his first words in 8 days. Go! 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 The success of silent reconnaissance patrols like Walker's created a template that Australian SAS would refine throughout the war. But both sides adapted. By mid-1967, the Viet Cong and NVA had begun to recognize that something was hunting them in Phuoc Tuy. Trails were booby-trapped more heavily. Security patrols increased. Instructions were issued to watch for the quiet Australians who didn't behave like American forces. We got intelligence reports that the VC were specifically warning their units about us, said Captain Terry Banjo O'Neill of 2 Squadron. They called us ghosts. They knew we operated differently from the Americans. Smaller patrols, longer duration, different insertion techniques. They respected us. But more importantly, they feared us because they couldn't predict where we'd be or when we'd strike. The Australians responded by becoming even more invisible. Insertion techniques evolved. Instead of landing directly near the target area, helicopters would conduct multiple false insertions, touching down in several locations before actually dropping the patrol. This made it nearly impossible for observers to know where the Australians had actually gone to ground. We'd ride the chopper for an hour, touch down 6 or 7 times, recalled Sergeant Barry Blackie Peterson. The crew would drop smoke, we'd lean out like we were jumping, but we wouldn't actually get off. Then maybe on the 3rd or 5th touchdown, we'd disappear into the scrub. Meanwhile, Charlie's watching from somewhere trying to figure out which insertion was real. By the time he checked all the false LZs, we'd be kilometers away. Movement techniques became even more refined. The Australians adopted what they called moving like smoke, advancing so slowly that any vegetation disturbance had time to settle before an observer would look directly at that spot. A kilometer might take 6 hours to cover. American recon teams would cover 5 to 7 clicks a day, explained Corporal Don Smithy Anderson. We'd do 1 click, maybe 2 if we were in a hurry. But we'd see everything, hear everything. Speed compromises security. We chose security every time. The patrol's ability to remain undetected for extended periods created a psychological weapon as powerful as any rifle. Enemy forces never knew if they were being watched. Every trail, every camp, every supply cache could have Australian eyes on it. The uncertainty was corrosive. A captured NVA officer told his interrogators in 1968, "We could deal with American operations. They were predictable. Helicopters, artillery, large forces moving loudly. But the Australians, we never knew where they were. A patrol would pass through an area we controlled, and 3 days later, bombs would fall on our headquarters. How did they know? Who told them? The answer was terrifying. They had been there, watching us, and we never knew." The intelligence gathered by silent patrols proved decisive in multiple operations. Before the Battle of Bin Ba in June 1969, SAS patrols had been observing NVA movement patterns for weeks, providing detailed maps of enemy positions. Before Operation Overlord in 1971, patient surveillance identified every bunker, cache, and trail in the operational area. "We weren't just gathering intelligence," said Trooper Gary Nobby Clark. "We were building a complete picture of how the enemy operated in our area. Where they moved, when they moved, what they carried, how they communicated. Over months, you'd see patterns emerge. And those patterns meant we could predict and preempt. Communication techniques also evolved. The Australians developed even more efficient hand signals, including signals for complex tactical situations. They practiced until communication became nearly telepathic. A patrol commander could convey detailed instructions with 3 hand gestures that would take a paragraph to write. Physical conditioning became crucial. Operating in extended silence required extraordinary self-control. Coughing could get you killed. A sneeze could compromise the mission. Troopers learned to suppress natural reflexes, to control their breathing even under extreme stress, to remain motionless for hours while insects crawled over them. "I've sat in an ambush position for 9 hours without moving," said Trooper Mick Bluey Williams. "Leeches on my legs, ants biting my arms, leg cramping so bad I thought I'd scream." But you don't move. You don't make a sound. Because 20 meters away, there's an enemy patrol. And if they hear you, you're dead. So you embrace the pain, you accept it, and you become stone. By 1969 to 1970, Australian SAS silent reconnaissance had achieved a level of effectiveness that made them the most requested special operations unit in Vietnam among American commanders. The statistics were remarkable. In over 200 patrol insertions between 1966 and 1971, only one Australian SAS patrol was ever completely overrun and eliminated. Their kill ratio was approximately 100.1. But more importantly, the intelligence they gathered prevented countless casualties by identifying enemy concentrations before they could attack. "We'd have American colonels requesting Australian SAS attachments," recalled Major Blue Morrison, who served 2 tours with the squadron. "They'd seen what we could do. They understood that 5 Australians, properly trained and operating silently, could gather more useful intelligence than a whole company of conventional troops." The patrol led by Sergeant Reg Duke Wilson in February 1970 exemplified the technique's maturity. Wilson's team spent 12 days, not 10, 12, in the Nui Thi Vai Hills without speaking a single word. They observed a major enemy supply route, counting over 600 NVA regulars and mapping an extensive tunnel network. Their radio reports, transmitted in brief encrypted bursts, guided a coordinated operation involving Australian infantry, American armor, and RAF bombers that destroyed the entire complex. "We called in over 40 artillery fire missions based on targets we'd personally observed," Wilson said. "Everyone was a confirmed hit because we'd literally walked the target with laser precision. That's what silence bought us. The ability to get close enough to provide grid coordinates accurate to 10 meters. The Vietnamese perspective revealed the psychological impact. A former Viet Cong fighter named Nguyen Van Thanh, interviewed decades after the war, recalled, "The American units, we could hear them coming from kilometers away. We could avoid them, or we could prepare ambushes. But the Australians, they were different. Sometimes we would find evidence they had been watching us. A fighting position abandoned, equipment left behind, cigarette butts. They had been there, close enough to touch us, and we never knew." Another former NVA soldier, Tran Minh Duc, was more direct. "We called them Kai Khao, the wood ghosts. They moved through the jungle like spirits. No sound, no smell, no sign. Then suddenly artillery would rain down on positions we thought were secret, or an ambush would catch us on trails we thought were safe. It was unsettling. We learned to fear the silence." The technique also proved its worth in combat situations. On September 3, 1969, Corporal Keith Rue Payne's patrol was compromised by an NVA unit in Phuoc Tuy. For 18 hours, they evaded multiple enemy patrols through complete silence and minimal movement. Despite being tracked by over 40 enemy soldiers, they successfully evaded capture and called in their own extraction. The enemy literally walked over their hide position twice without detecting them. "We were in a drainage ditch, covered in mud and leaves," Payne remembered. NVA soldiers stood on the banks 2 meters above us. We could see their boots, hear them talking, smell their cigarettes. But they never looked down. They were looking for men who would run, who would panic, who would make noise. We were none of those things. We were invisible. The Australian SAS's mastery of silent reconnaissance operations left an indelible mark on special operations doctrine worldwide. When SAS squadrons rotated home from Vietnam, they brought back techniques and lessons that would influence military training for decades. The British SAS studied Australian patrol reports extensively. American Special Forces revised their LRRP training to emphasize noise discipline. Even Israeli commandos adopted elements of the silent patrol methodology. What the Aussies proved in Vietnam, noted Lieutenant Colonel Charles Beckwith, founder of Delta Force, was that in guerrilla warfare, silence is a weapon as potent as firepower. Maybe more potent, because you can't shoot what you can't hear. The technique's effectiveness came at a psychological cost. Operating in extended silence, living for days or weeks without verbal communication, maintaining constant vigilance, suppressing natural human behaviors, created intense mental strain. Many SAS veterans reported that readjusting to normal conversation after a patrol took hours. Some developed an almost supernatural awareness of sound that lasted for years. I came home in 1970, recalled Corporal Jim Hennessy. Took me months before I could sleep with any noise. My wife would talk to me, and I'd instinctively freeze and scan for threats. The silence became part of you. It changed how you perceived the world. But the operational success was undeniable. While overall Australian casualties in Vietnam were proportionally similar to other Allied forces, the SAS's casualty rate was extraordinarily low, given their operational exposure. They penetrated enemy-controlled territory repeatedly, gathered critical intelligence, and returned safely because they had mastered the art of becoming invisible through silence. The fundamental lesson that patience, discipline, and silence could overcome numerical and territorial disadvantage resonates in counterinsurgency operations today. Special Operations Forces in Iraq and Afghanistan studied Australian SAS patrol reports from Vietnam, recognizing that the core principles remained valid. Move slowly, observe carefully, communicate minimally, strike decisively. In the end, those silent days in the Vietnamese jungle represented a unique moment in military history. 5 men, utterly alone in enemy territory, surviving not through firepower, but through discipline so complete that they became indistinguishable from the jungle itself. They didn't speak because speaking meant death. They didn't move unnecessarily because movement meant compromise. They became ghosts by choice, by training, by sheer force of will. And in that silence, they won a war within a war. Not the political conflict that would ultimately be lost, but the tactical and operational battle for information, initiative, and survival. The Vietnamese never conquered the silence. They never learned to hear the ghosts, and that failure cost them dearly, operation after operation, ambush after ambush, until the Australians finally withdrew in 1971. The ultimate tribute came from a former NVA officer interviewed in 2001. The Americans we could fight. The Australians we could only try to avoid. When we encountered silence in the jungle, we knew. They were there, watching. And there was nothing we could do but hope they chose not to kill us that day.